Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. This is actually our first webinar that we are running. So it'd be great to hear your feedback, and we look forward to sort of running many more of these webinars as well in the future. My name's Georgia. I'm a registered psychologist and consultant at People Solutions. And next to me is my colleague Courtney. We didn't colour coordinate our outfits today. They just happen to both be quite bright, so hope you enjoy. She's also a registered psychologist and consultant at People Solutions as well. So we look forward to sharing our insights with you today. So in terms of the structure of the session, we're not going to be chatting for the whole hour. The talk itself will probably go for about half an hour. Then we'll open up to some questions. So if anything does pop out throughout the session, feel free to write it in the Q&A box and we can respond to those at the end. Anything that we don't get to in the session, we'll sort of write it up and send an email around to everyone as well at the end. That will include the recording and the slides as well. So you'll have all that information there, and feel free to forward that on to anyone who may have missed the session or you think would be of benefit hearing any of the stuff that we talk about today. So I suppose before we jump in, who we are, if anyone on the line isn't familiar with People Solutions as a business, we are a Perth-based organisational psychology business. We are based in WA, so our head office is in Subiaco, and we deal primarily with Western Australian or Australian-based organisations as well. So we do have a really strong track record of providing assessment centres and assessment solutions as well. So essentially the structure of the session today, initially I'm going to be just giving a bit of a brief rundown in terms of, what assessment centres are for those who may be less familiar, and also look at that challenge, what that challenge was that we were trying to solve when we developed these online assessment centres. Then we'll go into case studies. So I'll be talking to a couple of case studies where we ran online assessment centres. And Courtney will also be mentioning another one that she's run herself. And then the last part will be about lessons learned and sort of limitations and recommendations for the future as well. So I do hope that you find value in the information that we provide today as well. As I understand, there may be people with varying levels of understanding of assessment centres on the webinar today. So just to give you a bit of an initial introduction and as a refresher for those who are familiar, what an assessment centre is, it's essentially a structured and objective approach to selecting candidates for a role. So what that looks like is it's a multi-method and multi-assessor process. Multi-method means that candidates get to participate in more than one activity as a part of the assessment centre day. So what those activities might look like, there could be some behavioural-based activities. These are typically things like you may have heard of, building a tower out of Lego or building a tower out of spaghetti. So it's these kind of practical, team-based, hands-on tasks. Behavioural activities may also include things like group discussion activities where candidates have a bit of a chat and problem solve together through a scenario. It could also be things like one-on-one role plays as well, or any sort of work sample activities too. Another activity could be an interview. So these may be things like behavioural or technical interviews as well, or situational based interviews. And another piece may be sort of psychometric assessments, whether these are things that candidates complete on the day or whether it's something that they complete prior and the information is discussed on assessment centre day. The beauty of it being a multi-method approach is that you get to see the way a candidate behaves in more than one setting as well, particularly for candidates that may be a little bit more reserved or quiet in those group activities. You get to see how they're going to be one-on-one in those interview performance, or vice versa. If they're not too strong at interview, you might see them perform a little better in those team-based activities as well. So it's really good from both ends in terms of assessors being able to understand candidates' behaviour and performance, but also a candidate having a good experience in terms of the session and feeling like they were able to really show themselves on the day as well. The other piece of the puzzle is that it's a multi-assessor approach. So what this suggests is that the candidate doesn't go through each of these activities and is assessed by the same person, because there would be a conflict of interest or a bias if that assessor was to assess candidates throughout the whole day. So it's multi-assessor, which means there's more than one person from the organisation or consultancy that will be assessing the candidates on the day. These can be, HR, hiring managers, psychologists, that can assess these candidates throughout the day as well. The beauty of this is that these activities elicit these candidates' behaviours in more than one setting. So you feel like you have a really good understanding of how the candidate's going to perform at the end of the session as well. So again, just to reiterate those benefits, is that it is one of the best predictors of understanding a candidate on the job performance. But not only that, it's also an opportunity for organisations to sell their company to the candidates as well. From our experience, a lot of candidates come away with really good feedback from assessment centres. They really appreciate the opportunity to not only speak with, recruitment or HR, but also speak with hiring managers, line managers, operational staff as well. It also allows us to do a large volume in a really short period of time. So, you could see around 30 candidates in a day for assessment centres, and because there's more than one person, lots of activities, they are really good ways of getting through a big volume in a very short period of time. So in terms of what the challenge was, or the problem that we're trying to solve, obviously, COVID's thrown in a bit of a curveball for all of us this year due to the border restrictions, social distancing. When we're in complete lockdown, a lot of companies still needed to hire and fill people for roles, particularly those, essential positions as well. A lot of companies didn't stop, and particularly as lockdown finished and restrictions were easing, there was an immediate ramp up in a lot of organisations' recruitment practices. So essentially, how do we meet these hiring outcomes whilst maintaining best practice in a virtual setting and in the virtual world as well? Some other things that we really needed to consider, so some other problems that we recognise that we might face, are things around, these different candidates. What are their sort of demographics and attributes? Are they going to have computer proficiency? Are they in a position where they might be adversely impacted by technology, jumping online? Are they working night shift or working away, and is it a bit too challenging for them to have reliable internet access as well? Also considering things like technological issues, any sort of disruptions, dropout of internet, also adapting the activities. So those building of, spaghetti towers or Lego towers are really great in an in-person assessment centre. However, unfortunately, it's not something that, the technology isn't advanced enough for us to be able to send over pieces of Lego to other candidates. So those practical activities were essentially out the door when it comes to the online assessment centres. So mainly focusing on things like psychometric assessments, interviews and group discussion activities, other things that can be easily replicated online, and also thinking about what level of candidate is that going to be most appropriate for as well. I suppose one of the biggest things that we also needed to consider was around best practice. Sometimes when thinking about what is best practice, it's easier to think about what isn't best practice. So best practice assessment centres is not chucking a bunch of candidates in a room together, asking them to complete a task and then assessing them on your judgment or inference. It's not having sort of arbitrary measurements of best performance, no sort of ambiguity in terms of what expectations are. It's not things like speed interviewing where candidates are asked to move really quickly from table to table. It's just not providing candidates with the best opportunity to sort of get to know you and to show their best potential as well. So what is best practice? Best practice assessment centres, if they're done really well and they meet all these criteria, is a great predictor of on-the-job performance. So what you're looking for is, and what we needed to ensure that we replicated, was really clear competencies. So we needed to ensure that each of the candidates were measured against, job critical criteria, which, for most of our assessment centres were things that were pre-established. So these are things that we were already sort of measuring in face-to-face assessment centres ahead of time as well. Exercises, they need to elicit these competencies and these job critical behaviours, and they also need to be role level appropriate. So like I mentioned before, having those group discussion activities, if we can only do those online, we need to ensure that the candidates, that the activities are going to be appropriate for that level of candidate as well. So, graduate level candidates are, those discussion activities are really great for those types of roles as well. We need to ensure that our ratings are really clear and objective. So thinking about what does a low performer look like, and what does a high performer look like, and what does an average performer look like as well for each of those competencies. Things like scheduling is one of the big tasks, but it is something where assessment centres are going to run smoothly for candidates and assessors if they do have a very consistent and clear schedule. And also ensuring that assessors aren't assessing the same candidate more than once, again, to remove any sort of bias or conflict of interest as well. The last piece is really around the assessor training. So best practice highlights that all assessors need to be trained on the competencies, the exercises, the ratings, just so that they're remaining consistent in terms of their approach, and that they have a good understanding in terms of what's expected of them on the day as well. So we had to ensure that all of our assessment centres still aligned with each of these best practice criteria. Another thing we also needed to consider was candidate experience. So it can be all well and good to have best practice, good running technology, but you need to ensure that it's also an enjoyable day for the candidates as well. So not only is it a way for us to recognise if a candidate's going to be a good fit for the position, but it's also a way for candidates to understand whether they're going to be a good fit for your organisation. Self-selection is a much cheaper way of sort of removing candidates from a process, rather than them being hired and working out down the way that this isn't going to be the right fit for them as well. So it works both ways, and candidates also, they really enjoy those face-to-face assessment centres. So it's thinking about how we're going to replicate that same sort of informal, relaxed environment in a bit more of a formal online setting as well. The use of technology in assessment centres, the research is very much so in its infancy, but it can, result in a bit of a reduction of interest or engagement from candidates as well. So what we're really looking at is, how do we maintain best practice? How do we ensure candidates have a good time, whilst also looking at things like technology, and ensuring that these, online assessment centres are going to be a really good fit for candidates and meet those hiring targets as well. So lots of things that we sort of thought about when developing these online assessment centres. So moving on to the second part now, how we sort of worked through this, we're going to talk through three, really quite different case studies. The first one that I'll talk through is one that we did during lockdown. So this is an assessment centre that still ran where all of the assessors were, at home. The second one, Courtenay will be talking through, and this one will be more sort of lockdowns over, restrictions easing. And then the third one is one that I'll be talking through, and this one will be more around, restrictions have eased, but borders are still closed as well. So our first case study, our first virtual assessment centre that we ran was for an entry-level role within a mining services organisation. So with this organisation, we've been running face-to-face assessment centres for over a year. So our competencies were very much well defined. A lot of trainings were running quite smoothly. And, they were also running quite fast as well. So this organisation, increased to monthly basis assessment centres. So we were running these month to month, and then COVID happened, and unfortunately that put a bit of a stop to those face-to-face assessment centres. So really the challenge for this organisation was to meet the business targets, the growing demand, but also ensure that the candidates were assessed on those role critical factors. So from some statistical analyses that we've done on our end, the candidates that had already been going through the assessment centre had shown really good performance in this organisation's training centre, and there'd also been a noticeably massive reduction in turnover as well. So it was really important for us to maintain elements of this assessment centre as well. So by using those predetermined competencies and the same ratings and assessors, we could at least keep some of that best practice involved as well. Things that we also need to think about was the massive volume of candidates and also the timing. So a lot of these guys were on site still, they were working night shift. So finding a time where everyone was able to sort of log in at the same time and complete a live virtual assessment centre wasn't going to be viable for this demographic as well. There was also, queries in terms of the candidates' technological proficiency or computer proficiency as well. So again, this is where using a live streaming platform wasn't going to be a good fit for these candidates, and also given the circumstance as well, with all the assessors being in lockdown, a lot of the candidates working night shift. So what we did, as a part of the process, we continued to use psychometric assessments. So we used ability assessments and a personality profile. And then we also included some situational judgment type questionnaires. So these were particularly around safety and FIFO fit, which were things that were identified as, role critical factors as well. And then what we asked is that the candidates completed these assessments prior to the next stage of the assessment centre. So essentially what this assessment centre looked like is a bit of an asynchronous approach in that there was lots of different components that were completed over several sittings and several days, rather than all of it in one go that you might be used to from a traditional assessment centre. So they completed psychometric assessments first. Then we sort of moved on to our interviews. So this was our behavioural based interview questions that we, already completed prior with our face-to-face assessment centres. And then what we also did was develop some scenario-based interview questions. The benefit of using the scenario-based interview questions was because we weren't able to replicate the practical activity, we still needed to measure things like communication and teamwork. So these questions sort of presented a hypothetical scenario for candidates, where they did have to interact with others or solve a problem. And they essentially had to say, how they would go about interacting with this individual or working through this issue as well. So you were able to sort of understand how they would deal with sort of team-based activities and what their communication style was like as well. All of this information was collected once the candidates had completed these components, so the psychometric data, as well as the interview data. And then all of that information was captured in a spreadsheet and was discussed, over a Microsoft Teams meeting with each of the assessors, particularly those line managers, because they really enjoyed being a part of the assessment centre. So it was always really helpful having one of those guys on board to discuss the candidate's performance as well. Essentially, during this time, during COVID, this organisation was still able to meet hiring requirements whilst presenting quite a flexible assessment centre option for candidates as well. And also the assessors were still able to be involved in the process, which was really important for them. And in terms of those additional components that we added to the online assessment centre in terms of the additional psychometric assessments and scenario-based interview questions, these are still used in this organisation's face-to-face assessment centres to this day as well, because they saw the value in using those measures. We've also replicated this sort of virtual asynchronous approach to this organisation's apprentices during restrictions, and we're also going to be looking to implement it for overseas graduate roles as well, where there is that massive time difference and we need to provide that more flexible asynchronous approach as well. I'm going to pass you over to Courtney now. He's going to talk about the next case study.
Thanks, Georgia. So this next case study is with our health services organisation. We've been running assessment centres with them for a couple of years now. They have a big annual recruitment drive for a student role that attracts over 1,000 applicants each year, and they use assessment centres as part of that recruitment process to whittle down the applicants. As we're coming into all the COVID restrictions and lockdown, we ended up postponing the assessment centres initially. There were some concerns we wouldn't be able to run them at all. And then luckily, as lockdown opened up in WA and restrictions started easing, we were actually able to run in-person assessment centres. There was a concern because they need to meet these annual recruitment requirements to meet operational needs. So we definitely had to still assess these candidates in some manner. So luckily we were able to run in-person assessment centres in Perth, but obviously there were still the border closures and there were interstate applicants who had made it through to this stage of recruitment, but they were unable to travel to Perth as they would do in previous years for in-person assessment centres, and they had to be assessed at this stage because they'd made it so far already in the process. So what we ended up doing was actually doing a bit of a combined model where we ran in-person assessment centres for the local applicants, obviously with extra safety measures. And then we created virtual assessment centres for those interstate applicants on the last couple of days of assessment centres. So we had to make sure, because we were doing this combined model, that the session structure, activities, process, assessors, everything had to be as similar or the same between the in-person and virtual assessment centres, so that we didn't end up adversely impacting or disadvantaging those interstate applicants in any way. And as with the other assessment centres, we had to be aware of all the technological requirements and issues that could come up. So in terms of some of the things that we did, we usually do quite a hands-on practical activity for this assessment centre. So we converted it to a discussion activity for this assessment centre this year. That also helped with social distancing and hygiene requirements because candidates weren't handling the same materials in person, and it allowed us to use a format that could be done virtually. And candidates also participated in different one-on-one activities with assessors as well. We were able to keep identical day plans and activities between virtual and in-person, and we had all of our assessors in the same location. We actually ran the sessions, the virtual sessions, via Microsoft Teams. So the way this actually looked in person was all of the candidates and assessors logged into one meeting link on Teams for a briefing and an introduction session at the start of the day. So they were introduced to the different assessors and given a rundown of what would happen. Then they were sent different meeting links for each activity they would be participating in. So each candidate and each assessor was given their individual day plan with all the different activities, what times, and the link that they needed to click onto. So after the briefing, half of the candidates, there were 8 in total, so 4 were split into one meeting link for a group discussion activity and the other 4 went into individual activities. And then they swapped over because we had all the assessors in the same location. Once we finished up at the end of the session, we were able to run an in-person wash-up session where we actually discussed each candidate's performance one at a time, but all in the same location. At the end of all of the activities and assessments, we had all of the candidates log in to the same meeting link again for a Q&A session. So it tried to create that bit of informal discussion, a chance for candidates to talk to assessors and ask any questions that they might have, because we know from experience that's such a valuable part of the process for them. Any instructions for activities we hosted on Dropbox and sent links through Teams at the start of each activity as well. And we built in extra time to the sessions to account for tech issues. So we ended up running 5 virtual sessions over 2.5 or 3 days. Obviously, we did have tech issues, but we let everybody know ahead of time that if anything happened, we would pause timers, pause activities, get people back online, get things happening. to avoid disadvantaging anybody. We actually found that it was quite easy to observe and assess the same behaviours over Microsoft Teams that we had seen in person in both the group and individual activities. And the interactions and communication between the candidates in the virtual group activity was quite natural. And we actually had the last group of the week ended up giving each other a virtual high five, which was quite funny for us to see, but it just showed sort of how natural that interaction ended up being. And this format was so successful that for this particular organisation that they ended up using it a couple of months later for another recruitment process. So they had quite a senior position in the organisation that they have a pool for each year. But the applicants for this pool are based remotely all across WA, and it was hard to get them to Perth at the same time. We still had restrictions happening. So we ended up doing the same thing, conducting a virtual assessment centre over Microsoft Teams with the same group, or different group activity, but the same format with group activity and individual activities. We had smaller sessions, which actually made it much easier to manage. So just 4 candidates per session. And again, all the assessors in the same location as well, and with the same format, sending out meeting and Dropbox links to candidates ahead of time. We actually found the format was quite convenient for the candidates because they were able to participate without having to travel to Perth. So without having to make the time, for someone that would have been a good half-day drive just to get in, they would have lost a couple of days getting to and from assessment centres and participating. So this way they were able to tune in from home or from work. And it was easier then as well for the recruiters to coordinate that process. Now I'll hand back to George for the last one.
All right, so our very last case study is an online assessment centre that we ran for a mining and chemical manufacturing organisation for multidisciplinary graduate roles. So for this organisation, they had a year of growth this year and also introduced a new graduate training program. So, you know, it's really important for them to be able to roll out this new program that they were really excited about. And, you know, to roll out a program, you need grads and you need someone that's going to be a good fit for the organisation. So essentially we need to fill those vacancies. Whilst, you know, for local candidates, so those based in Perth, we were able to run a face-to-face assessment centre. But this organisation had sites and locations across Australia as well. And therefore, you know, their candidate pool was Australia-wide as well. And with border restrictions, we weren't able to sort of host an assessment centre interstate. What we did was also do an online virtual assessment centre as well as a face-to-face assessment centre. So for Western operations, we ran one face-to-face assessment centre for the day, looking at multiple sort of multidisciplinary graduate roles. And then we ran a virtual assessment centre. So we really needed to ensure, similarly to the case study that Courtney just spoke about, we need to make sure that the activities were able to be consistently run face-to-face and online as well. So what the activities were mainly 2 group discussion activities. So as I mentioned before, group discussion activities, they're really great for graduate roles, particularly, you know, a lot of organisations look at things like critical thinking, problem solving, communication, teamwork, which can be elicited from those group discussion activities. These guys also completed psychometric assessments prior to the assessment centres, which were able to be done online. And they also had a behavioural interview question as well. So we really need to make sure that the activities weren't technical based, because there was lots of different sort of disciplines coming into the assessment centre. You don't want to disadvantage one discipline over the other, particularly, and instead just looking at those behaviours. So those things around sort of problem solving, teamwork, communication, and that side of things. So again, similarly to Courtney, we also needed to consider things like technical requirements and issues. Because these guys were graduates, they were quite familiar with online conferencing systems and platforms. You know, a lot of their university degree sort of towards the end had to be online webinars and things like that as well. So these guys had a pretty good understanding of technology and platforms, probably more so than some of us as well. So essentially, like I mentioned before, our solutions was having one face-to-face session, one online session with activities that are able to be replicated across the settings as well. The assessor training, we had one face-to-face for the face-to-face assessment centre, but then we ensured that we had a specific online assessor training for those that were going to be assessing during the online assessment centre. This is because of, first thing, training them on the technology that they were going to be using, but also explaining to assessors and training them on how to look for behaviours online. Obviously you can only see someone's sort of front half of their face, you can't see full body language. So really sort of identifying to assessors what you're going to be looking for and having those different expectations face-to-face as you are online. We replicated the same day plan face-to-face as the online assessment centre. However, similarly to Courtenay, we reduced the number of candidates. So we had 4 candidates per session, and this made it much of an easier flow for the assessors, but also for the candidates as well. Because we had a smaller number of candidates, they felt a lot more comfortable asking the assessors questions and having a bit more of an informal chat with them. A lot of the time when you're in webinars and you see lots of different faces pop up, you're less likely to sort of ask a question because you feel like someone else might ask the same question, or you might be more inclined to sort of take a step back and allow other people to take the lead as well. So I think we both noticed a benefit in having smaller number of candidates in an online assessment centre as well. For this one, we used Zoom as an online platform, and this worked super well, super easy. You send out one meeting link to the candidates. That's used for the introduction presentation, for the group activities. During the group activities, assessors were just asked to turn off their cameras and microphones so that the candidates could just focus on each other as well during that time. And then for the interview, I was facilitating the day and I popped everyone into breakout rooms with their assessors. And for the interviews, because there was 1 or 2 technical questions as well, we also would have an HR representative and a line manager in those interviews. We also ensured that we've just built in a little bit of extra time to allow for technological issues and breaks. You can't forget breaks, even when you're online. People still need to, have a quick water break. Similarly to the previous one, the instructions for activities were hosted on Dropbox. So what Courtenay and I did is we used Dropbox for Business, which allowed us to restrict the access to those files as well, just to make sure candidates weren't able to download them. And I think that's it. So essentially the results, we were able to successfully run assessment centres face-to-face and virtual. The beauty of the virtual assessment centre was that the candidates were from across Australia and the assessors were from across Australia as well. So some of them had never met each other within this organisation as well. So it was kind of a really nice, humbling way to sort of connect with people from across WA and Australia as well, and, giving them the same opportunity as those in the face-to-face assessment centre. The interactions and communications with candidates and assessors was actually really relaxed. And I think that's where it helps to have a bit of an icebreaker at the start, a bit of an initial presentation, Q&A session, and also, keeping those groups to quite small. You don't want to be assessing, up to 30 candidates in a session, because then it won't create that relaxed environment as well. I'm going to pass you over to Courtenay. Here's a photo of her in action at a virtual assessment centre. Who's going to now talk through the lessons learnt.
So obviously there were going to be some challenges and limitations with running assessment centres in this format. So tech issues are the biggest one and most obvious: internet dropping out, lagging in sound and video during group activities, or trouble loading documents, bandwidth issues. So we really had to keep this front of mind, just be aware to build in that extra time, allow for people to have those issues and to overcome them, and to have some solutions on hand as well. It's really important that candidates have access to the appropriate technology So both a laptop, good internet, all of those sorts of things, which was why we did the asynchronous assessment centres for the first one, because they weren't going to have that necessarily. There is a potential for disruption of having other people at home. Luckily, neither of us experienced that with any of our candidates, but that potential is there. There's not the same opportunity for informal interactions between assessors and candidates like you would have when you're all in person in the same building. So we tried to replicate that with the intros and Q&A sessions, but it's not going to be the same as in person. And that's something that we know from feedback that candidates really love from in-person assessment centres. You are limited in the types of activities you can run. As Georgia said, it's hard to build a Lego tower over Zoom. And these sorts of assessment centres are not going to be appropriate for all types of roles or candidates. But obviously there were some real benefits of doing this as well. So because candidates could participate from the comfort of their own home, it was easy for them to be punctual for the assessment centre. They didn't need to fight traffic or find parking. We actually found them, even though we built in extra time for tech issues, to be very time efficient to run. It was more accessible for interstate or remote candidates to participate, which actually gave our clients access to a much wider candidate pool across Australia than they would have had otherwise. And running assessment centres in this virtual format does allow you to really tailor them to accommodate different types of candidates and roles as well. And the biggest benefit was that it allowed organisations to meet these hiring targets during COVID. In terms of recommendations for future assessment centres, and this is purely based on our experiences, obviously maintaining best practice was really important. So we had those competencies that had been predetermined through job analysis ahead of time, but it's really important to do that going forward when you're creating these from scratch as well. And then we designed the activities and chose activities to elicit the behaviours relevant to those competencies. We had the rating sheets that we've used previously, and we just made sure to adapt these with new behavioural anchors to reflect the new activities we developed. In terms of scheduling, we made sure that we adhered to one assessor per candidate throughout the day, so people weren't assessed by the same person twice, and just tried to remove any potential conflicts of interest as well. And we've still kept up with that assessor training, including training assessors on the technology that they would be using as well. So it was really important to have those trained assessors. In terms of designing virtual assessment centres, so really considering the candidates was the most important thing. So looking at their role level, how technologically proficient they were, the access to technology, looking at what type of activities. Obviously practical activities are very difficult to do online, so discussion activities work better, but then you need to consider literacy levels, language, if English is a second language, making sure that candidates aren't being disadvantaged unfairly. Building in time for buffer time for tech issues, because there always will be, and building in time for breaks, and also looking, as Georgia mentioned, at the size of the sessions. So we found that smaller sessions with less candidates were much easier to manage design-wise than larger sessions. In terms of a few other tips, we found it was really beneficial to have someone who was a dedicated facilitator, just to make sure that everybody was where they needed to be, to follow up with any candidates who are having tech issues, and just to manage the whole process. And also just understand that virtual assessment centres are different to in-person assessment centres, and to adjust your expectations of candidates. Things like if you've got people that seem like they're talking over the top of each other in a group activity, it could be lagging with the video or the sound. So just keeping those sorts of things in mind. In terms of platforms, we did look at different virtual assessment centre specific platforms, because there are a few out there. We did find that for us, though, they were a bit pricey, and also it was quite difficult to tailor them to the level we needed. We wanted to tailor things like day plans, competencies, activities, assessor allocation, and it was quite difficult to do that to the level we needed on these platforms. However, we found that it was quite easy to use existing video conferencing platforms like Teams and Zoom to run assessment centres. There were some differences between them. So in Zoom, we could have one link for the assessment centre and send people to breakout rooms, whereas in Teams, it was separate meeting links for every activity. Zoom, it was easier for us as external facilitators to have permission to run it and to access the meetings, as opposed to with Teams, we needed permission to enter each of the meetings ourselves as well from someone internally. However, there are organisations that do have security restrictions that prevent them from using Zoom, and so Teams is quite beneficial for those organisations. And just a few final thoughts before we wrap up. We'd noticed even before this that there was an increasing demand for virtual recruitment solutions, and this had only been increasing leading up to and during COVID. And COVID has really forced us to explore ways to run assessment centres and recruit in this virtual world. It did allow our customers to meet recruitment requirements, and it allowed candidates to access recruitment opportunities without needing to travel. There's limited research so far, because this is such a new area, around both the effectiveness and the candidate experience in virtual versus in-person assessment centres. And there's a lot more work that's going to be needed here to help us understand what is best practice in this virtual world. And we know that virtual assessment centres are going to be part of the future of recruitment, so it's important that we continue to do them well and continue looking at ways that we can keep improving them. So that's all for our presentation. We'll have a quick look at the Q&A box and see if we have any questions. If anybody does have any questions, feel free to add them to either the Q&A or to the chat box. We'll pull those up and have a look. And I suppose just adding on to what Courtney said, although research still needs to be done, it's a very new area in terms of understanding best practice, but anecdotally, so feedback that we've received from candidates and assessors is that it was a really good experience. They enjoyed the process. The candidates felt that it was fair. Obviously, more research needs to be done in terms of understanding, whether these candidates go on to be, top performers as well, and whether it still is, as good a predictor of job performance as the face-to-face assessment centres. But anecdotally, from our experience, it's, been really beneficial rather than sort of just going for interview alone. So we do have a question in there. Do we normally include exercises for the mining company but switch these out for additional assessments and kept everything else the same? Yeah, so if we think about the first mining organisation case study, essentially, yes, in our face-to-face assessment centres, we usually had a practical activity, which is, is really appropriate for those more hands-on level roles, and also a group discussion activity. In terms of when we then went to the virtual assessment centre, it was much too challenging for us to tee up a time where all of the assessors who were in full lockdown could sort of join into the assessment centre, as well as candidates who were typically already working on site and on night shift as well. So what we did was we removed the group activities, and what we did instead was developed some scenario-based interview questions, which helped to elicit those competencies that may be better measured in those group activities. So like I mentioned, things like teamwork, how would they respond in a certain situation where someone's done something. We also maintained the psychometric assessment and included the scenario-based scenario-based psychometric assessments as well. So things, we have, a fight by fit assessment and a safety assessment too. So we were able to understand the candidates' behaviours and knowledge in those areas as well. We kept the behavioural interview as well. Those interviews can either be done live or pre-recorded as well. So, typically we recommend running interviews live where you can, because then you're able to prompt and probe the candidate and build up that sort of more personal organisational brand. However, obviously due to timings, people being on site, sometimes it can be too much of a challenge to run those live interviews. So if you do have a pre-recorded interview, just make it really clear to the candidates that, a person will be assessing those responses rather than sort of... It won't be scored by a computer.
Yeah, so it won't be scored by a robot or anything like that. That way it brings in more of that personal touch, personal organisation brand and trust as well. If it is those pre-recorded interviews, ensure that you have those prompting and probing questions in there as well, just to ensure that the candidates do really sort of contribute, you know, the same amount of detail as each other as well. So I hope that answers your question. Anything else? Did anyone have any other questions?
Otherwise, feel free to get in touch with us, send us an email, or get in touch on LinkedIn if you've got any other questions, or want to ask anything else about our experiences running virtual assessment centres, and we're happy to have a chat and answer those later on.
Yeah, so as I mentioned at the start, we'll send you all a recording of this presentation as well as the slides. Feel free to get in contact with us, whether it's over LinkedIn, or give our office a call if you do have any further questions at all. We're also going to be sending through a bit of a feedback form or a survey. Like I mentioned before, this is our first webinar, so we'd love to hear how you found it. You know, is it the appropriate amount of detail for you, and was it helpful? And also, you know, is there anything else that you'd like to hear from us? Any other topics that you'd like to be covered as well? So we'd also love to hear that from you as well. Cool. That seems to be it. Thank you so much for your time, everyone, for taking time out of your lunch. We look forward to sort of speaking with you soon. Thanks.